So again, thank you for being on here. It is Elias, right?
It is,
And
yeah.
Dummer.
Yes,
Okay.
Elias Dummer.
Yes.
Unfortunately and fortunately.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes for a lot of opportunities for jokes when you introduce
Yeah,
yourself, right?
that's
So,
right. Yeah, no one forgets my last name. That's for sure.
That's right.
so what is the most redundant
Right.
joke you hear that you just kind of say, haha, that's funny, where your name is concerned? What's the most
Oh,
redundant
man.
one?
Well, the problem is that my parents, I often go by Eli, and
Okay.
my parents called me Eli forever. But apparently, God bless them, they were not bright enough to notice that they added is to my first name.
Okay.
So my name in and of itself,
Eli is Dummer.
Yeah.
Then
no
what?
joke at all. There's
Then
no. Yeah, you don't even need to. You don't even need a punchline. It is the punchline.
There you go.
do you have
Pretty bad.
siblings?
I do. I have two brothers
Ooh.
and an adopted sister.
Or are they
Uh,
older? Do you have older?
No, I'm the oldest. So.
Okay. So they weren't
My-
saying you were dumber than one of your other siblings, at least.
No.
They-
It was well, and it's funny. Like I used to always joke that people would say, "Did you get made fun of a lot in school?" And I was like, "Yes, once per year." And
Right.
that was the. We grew up in a rough and tumble part of town, so you know how it goes. But
Yeah.
that's not really my actual way of doing life. But it's a decent quip. But
Yeah.
no, the people jump to with the B or all the things. I mean, I've had it all. But the name itself
Yeah.
just serves it on a silver platter.
Yeah.
It's
There you go.
That is pretty great. I admit I didn't think of that or that's pretty great. Eli is.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that
It's dumber.
perspective, but yeah.
Well, if people don't know you go by Eli, I guess they don't think
Yeah.
about it. But you know, when you're
Yeah.
introduced as Eli as a kid, then you go, "Oh shoot!"
Well, and of course, on this end, we spent a lot of time saying, okay, how do we get to this point to clarify? So I appreciated you clarifying that right off the bat, because I'm sure you've heard it 100 times. It's like, yes, it is Dumber, just for the clarification, but
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Well, and my family's very English too. So you start like English, Irish, Scotch. You start calling us Dumay, and it's a whole. There's war to be had.
Oh yeah, that's true. It is exactly what it is. Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
I was
What?
having a conversation with a UK publication not too long ago, which was pretty funny because Sarah Ferguson, if you remember the Weight Watchers commercials and all
Yeah.
of that, she's from Dummer, England.
Oh wow.
Oh, wow.
This whole thing. Those of us with this ridiculous name are apparently quite proud of the Weight Watchers princess. The whole thing.
That's
Now,
another claim to fame.
Yeah, there we go. You know?
Did you know that prior? Or is that
Prior to what, having my name, no.
no about Sarah Ferguson and that whole thing, or did you
No,
figure that out?
At some point, I don't know, when we were
Yeah.
teenagers or something, my dad was like, "So it turns out Fergie is from," and it was before the other Fergie came
Yeah.
along. So that was it.
Yeah,
Neat.
not quite. Yeah, if not quite as of a claim to fame of the new Fergie. I mean that.
No, it would be much cooler if that Fergie
That's right.
was from Dummer, England, but alas.
All right. Well, speaking of cool, I'd love to talk about your new album and just a few things about it.
Sure.
First of all, it's really cool that you raised the money. I mean, I think you produced it. You did everything, right? I mean,
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, less so than on my first solo record. So
Okay.
City Harmonic is, of course, like signed to record label, and we did self-produce the EP with Manifesto and everything
Okay.
through a barter deal, which is a whole story. And then the rest were all record label records, and then my deal finished. So typically, when you're signed to a record label, you either get dropped, or you finish your deal, or you never finish your deal, and you're in there for life. We had the luck of having been able to finish our deal. A couple records recouped, and I was able to go indie without it being terribly dramatic. So when the band
Okay.
retired, I went indie, and that
Okay.
was it. I mean, and so we did kind of a crowdfunding campaign for both Volume 1 and Volume 2.
yeah.
But Volume 2 whereas Volume 1 was a lot more like scratching all the itches that I never got to scratch in a band. Volume 2 was a little more like, okay, I'm a little more comfortable with what I want to do now. And a big part of that was working with friends. So I did,
Yeah.
I co-produced the record with Brent Milligan, who's
Okay.
a legend. played bass on Jesus Freak, and he
Wow.
like produced David Crowder Band and Torrin Wells and Colony House and
Wow.
all these rad projects. And then there's a lot of like collaborations on this record as well. So it's very communal, even though I did have a vision for it in a sense of what I wanted to do and played a heavy hand in all of it. It's still very much like doing cool things with my friends, you know?
I was going to ask you about that because, you know, a lot of the songs have, you know, bylines and different artists. And I also noticed, JJ Heller, she, I think, was in Manifesto, right? In that video. That's
Holy Wedding Day. So she did.
Yeah, sorry, not Manifesto.
No, it's great. She did a version of Holy Wedding Day with us years ago. We met years and years ago. Then when they moved to Nashville, we like helped them move in and hung out. And so we were kind of like family friends. I get together, particularly with her husband Dave, you know, pretty regularly. And so we love them. And so it's just one of those things where it's like, hey, we need to do a thing. Let's call up our pals. And it thankfully wasn't much more complicated than that. We just sorted out the details and made music. It was fun.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, I really liked seeing all the different artists you had on there. And I think you even had your son on at one point, right? Didn't he read a scripture?
Actually, no, my kids refused.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
Yeah, that is a voiceover from Fiverr. It is my kids full blown said no. I tried.
Oh, wow. They didn't want to be part of that friends group, huh?
No, I mean, they're, you know, we love each other.
No, I hear you.
But yeah, no, my kids did not want to be on a record. That was,
I'm sorry.
Wow.
I'm sorry I outed them. That was...
Okay, my daughter actually sang in a couple things on the first record as a solo artist. But no, they're all very talented and awesome people, but they did not want to read Deuteronomy on my album.
Right.
There you go. Didn't want that pressure at that moment. No, that's all right.
What ages are your kids?
So my youngest is 6 and my oldest is 15, and we've got 5. So it's
nice.
You know, every year and a half to 2 years through there. So we're kind of got a good spread.
Yeah.
You know, we got a kid who's got a full-time job and a kid who plays Roblox like it's his job. So
there you go.
Isn't it though?
It kind of is. Yeah. I mean, one day maybe.
Yeah. So speaking of your kids and that kind of thing and your passion, where did that come from for you? Music and your family, you know, growing up in your family, you know, that kind of thing, as you shared a little bit, you know, you kind of grew up in this construction world. And so it's like, you know, there's always automatically going to be this part of us that says, okay, yeah, music is fine, but how are you going to make a living type stuff, you know, that.
Yeah. Well, so my family, my dad's like a architectural engineer of sorts. He does like infrared heating stuff for big buildings.
Sure.
But every Saturday he would be working on the house and that sort of thing. I was honestly never really part of it. My family life growing up was like, you know, I come from a broken home, my parents divorced, and it got real complicated for a while. And so when my wife and I got married pretty young, we had my aunt and uncle who had 5 kids and this great life. They'd lived in Africa for years as missionaries. They came back and he was a contractor when he came back. And so that was all pretty great. For me, like kind of home reno stuff is really just recreational and a break for the rest of my life. But you know, I think having a tight knit family has been important to us from the get go. Honestly, partly because my family wasn't that. I have a brother. I have a brother who has autism, and you know, I have my bit of mental health stuff in my family's history, and. So it's just, you know, we're a couple generations away from family disasters. Let's put it that way. So I think for us, it's been important to sort of, as people who want to follow Jesus in all we do, try the best we can at least to create a community unto ourselves and have that be something good for the community. And I don't know that we're nailing it, but it's certainly been important to us all along.
Sure.
And I think in a lot of ways that's what music is. I mean, that's you're creating. And it's been a good bonding tool for me and my kids. My daughter sings, my son plays drums and piano. And
so cool.
It's just been fun to connect that way. So when this house is done, it will include a recording studio, which they'll all be able to mess around in. And I don't know, I never had that, so that's pretty wild.
That
is so cool. Yeah.
So for you, when do you remember that passion coming for you personally, even before your own personal family? You and your wife, kind of how was that developed? And as you walked with Jesus, how was that developed for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the church, so I think it was more. There was a youth pastor in my life who called us to kind of really see things as more than, I suppose, cultural Christianity. Canada was
Hmm.
pretty post-Christian
Mm.
my entire life. There was
Sure.
never a point in my life where going to church was a socially convenient, normal thing to do.
Uh,
Oh,
So,
wow.
I mean, I'm from urban Canada, so you can imagine it's halfway to Europe, and there's quite a lot with that. So the benefit of that is you grow up going to church, at least at the time, you grew up going to church, and for the most part, the people who are darkening the doors of that church mean to be there.
Hmm.
There's very little of the
yeah.
sort of go to church because it's Sunday. That's not a
Wow.
thing.
Sure.
So by high school, I had started leading worship when I was 13. So music and faith
Hmm.
were always pretty closely connected for me, and to be honest, there was some my relationship with that youth pastor became complicated over the
Mm.
years, and we could talk about that. There's actually a song on the record that
Mm.
with Citizens with Zach, who of course was
Mm.
part of Mars Hill out in
Hmm.
Seattle. So
Speaking
we
of
really
podcasts.
yeah, speaking of podcast. Yeah, so we really connected over some pretty similar experiences we had in that
Mhm.
regard.
Hmm.
But nevertheless, the good with the bad,
Hmm.
that guy, created a great community and a great group of a culture for calling each other into living the way of Jesus and knowing and being. I mean, it was the 90s and Toronto Airport was right around the corner. So you couldn't really avoid so much of what was happening in terms of, again, with the good and the bad, renewal and all of the things that were happening in the church in our area. So it was a really fascinating time growing up. And I think it's kind of forever left an imprint on us.
Hmm. No
Yeah.
doubt. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. When you don't see church as a social opportunity,
Yeah.
it definitely has a different viewpoint for you growing up the way you did.
Oh, totally. And it's
Yeah.
not that that doesn't exist at all, of course. It's just it's certainly not the norm. So
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
having been to church in the Bible Belt in the last 10 years when we
Yeah.
were in Nashville,
Yeah.
it is really, really different. Really, really
Yeah.
different.
That's kind of where I was coming from. It's like it's got what did you notice specifically in that era?
Well, no one ever, if you meet somebody in Canada, no one says, "What church do you go to?"
Hmm. I hear you.
It's not,
Yeah.
that's not coming up, you know?
Yeah.
And to the point where, like, and I've actually thought this, not to get all weird about it, but I've actually thought this sort of about the way we participate in culture as Christians, because, like,
Mm.
interestingly in Canada, there's a bit more of like indifference almost,
Hmm.
rather than animosity towards religion and spirituality and Christianity. And so it's a, at least at the everyday person you meet in the street. Right?
Sure.
It's not like they're anti-Christian. They're just like, oh, cute.
Yeah.
And then that's the end of the conversation, unless something comes up or life gets involved, which it often does. But I in the Bible Belt, there's a lot more of kind of a, what church do you go to? What denomination are you from? What's your grandpa do?
Yeah.
All that stuff that just isn't baked in. So like, there's nobody going to church in Canada to find their next real estate listing. Like that's not a thing. I mean, maybe it is, but not with any substantial quantity.
Huh.
Sure.
And that is definitely a phenomenon in Nashville.
Right.
Yeah.
You go to-
the politician goes to church for the 3 months leading up to his election and
Right.
all the
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I mean, you're talking about kind of some of the more, I don't know, cultural things, and I feel like a big part of this album has a lot to do with kind of some cultural shifts, but also I feel like they're, and this could just be me reading myself into the album. Sure. Well, so I guess what I'm saying is what you want, I think, as an artist, is you want people to hear themselves in the album and like kind of embrace it as if, did you write that for me kind of thing?
Right. Right.
So I'm sure there's some of that going on, but I also feel like maybe it is what's happening on your end. I don't know. But for me,
Definitely.
a big part of like a shift over the years is just learning what's important, what is meaningful, what actually matters to God versus doesn't. I think about watching, like, I went to a concert of the City Harmonic was there, Newsboys concert, City Harmonic.
Oh yeah, so
Yeah.
10 years ago almost.
Yes. And watching you guys do Manifesto, it was amazing. I mean, it's certainly one of my top 3 concert experiences. I loved it. I loved it. Just so you know. I loved it. Yeah. And a few people from our church went, including our worship leader. We ended up doing Manifesto at church many times after that.
Thank you, by the way.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my wife does the keys, and she nails the part. And yeah, I wish she was here. I'd have her play it for you. And we would indulge ourselves and make you endure it. Like, yeah, people play this for me all the time. Anyway, the point is, watching those YouTube videos, remembering that experience, and kind of hearing the lyrics of what you're saying. Like, do we need another song? Like, you know, like there's a progression, it seems like, in your faith of, I thought what mattered was this, and now I know what matters is this. That's a progression that I've been going through, and again, maybe reading into it, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So that's great. So I'll probably pop the bubble a little bit and say that the City Harmonic was born from an ecumenical missions movement. So the idea of being involved in social good, however you want to construe that, the idea of the church being predominantly about the good of the city and worshiping God through our entire lives holistically, that was part of our DNA the entire time. So what I think I've wrestled with is what role we play. I mean, there was certainly, we were in our 20s when that, late 20s, but in our 20s when that band kind of took off. So there was a little bit of like vigor and naivety, I think, potentially around how much we as a band could accomplish in terms of bringing churches together around the States, to the point where we lost our shirts in 2015 on a tour designed to do exactly that. We went around and we organized pastoral roundtables, and we were hosting, Lutherans and Catholics and Pentecostals at the same thing, and then trying to get them to take communion like idiots. But like, we're not total naivety, but we certainly tried to.
They don't call you Dummer for nothing.
Exactly, right? Yeah. But
Sorry.
And it's funny because that was great. That was well deserved too. We lost a lot of money doing it and don't regret it in the slightest.
Oh, cool.
So that was sort of baked into what we were doing. However, I think I've always had a lot of I guess meta level hope, and I still do meta level hope in the church, and by that I mean the global Christian church doing Jesus well. I think it's just increasingly the case, or increasingly apparent, that the disconnect between what we do as public Christianity and the doing of faith as a worship leader, as a guy who writes songs, as a thinker, as a nerd, that gap is widening, not shrinking. And I think that's difficult and frustrating and difficult in my own life because it's so disenchanting. So I'm seeing so many people, not disenchanting in terms of my relationship to Jesus. That's kind of what this record is about.
Yeah.
But disenchanting in seeing so many people I love and know so crushed by that gap that they feel like the only option they have is to completely turn off their brain or to completely deconstruct. And I'm kind of like that. We need to stop that game, because like there are, for me, the disentangling, if you will, of a belief here or there, that when you're in youth group, you're told this is what the Bible teaches. And then you read a few church history books and you go, hey, wait, that's like 80 years old. This thing that you're telling me is a non-negotiable is in the grand scheme of Christian history, a baby belief.
Sure.
And there's so many of those that you kind of and for us in the City Harmonic, the simple truth is that all was happening 18 years ago. So by the time the City Harmonic was already a band, we were already fish out of water in many of the circles that we were in. As obsessed with Jesus as ever in my life at this point, and then, but always sort of figuring out, hey, how do we navigate this by being faithful in our everyday? How do we navigate this by loving people well and being kind? And how do we? My first attempt with our effort in the City Harmonic was maybe if we unite and make it clear that we can unite missionally around the person of Jesus and the story and message of Jesus, not just in terms of saving souls, but in terms of saving neighborhoods. If we can do this, well, maybe that will. And I prior to 2016, I think that it was going. We had a lot of confidence that was the case, and then by the time the band ended, it was clear that things were getting very divided in culture and that sort of thing. And I think that's all escalated all of this to the point where now I'm kind of like, hey, you know what? Don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, I mean, like you've got Amos. I remain haunted, and people argue about the interpretation of this, but I remain haunted by Amos 5. I mean, there's this sense in which we have.
Aren't we all haunted by Amos 5?
But I mean, like this away with the noise of your festival, like away with all of these things, but let justice and righteousness. Like there's this kind of like sense of like, hey, you can do church all you want, but if church doesn't lead to the bottom line of your neighborhood being, a better place to live.
Yes.
And you're wasting my time and yours. And this is, the Lord speaking prophetically through Amos. And so you have true religion and James, you've got all this stuff. And so I think there is the business of doing church. And something I've kind of tried to offset. I mean, I've been a tent maker the whole time. And in that I own a marketing agency and a few small businesses in order for me to do music and ministry as earnestly as I can. I tried my best to take money off the table because of my own personality, not the role. And so we're not rolling in it, but we have at least we're able to participate in this by conviction, and that's been something I've kind of tried to foster to the best of my ability. But yeah, all of that to say, like I think for me, there really is the like doing of religion and then the way of Jesus. And it's not religion, it is religion, but it's doing that in every sphere of life is what we're called to, plain and simple.
Yeah, it's good.
That authenticity that basically goes through whatever my tent making role might be, whatever my whatever my service might be to the kingdom, as we may say.
Totally.
No, I appreciate that.
Also, while you're talking too, is so a big purpose behind our podcast here and is this idea of taking two polarized concepts. And the problem we recognize from the very beginning is we're not very polarized, so it can only go so far. But that is, the video froze.
It was that drink of water we figured on this end.
That's right. So you were saying, what were you saying, Mark?
All right.
We were talking about authenticity, and then Justin was basically sharing the concept of the podcast. Is we're not that polar opposite in some ways, but yet our desire is to create this
room for conversation.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think.
Are you guys recording, by the way? I don't see it.
Yes, not in Zoom. I'm recording via OBS.
Got it.
So.
Okay, sweet.
Thank you for asking.
But yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
We've been known to record a lot of things and not get it down, so that's our
record.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah.
Back to polarization.
Yeah, big reason for the podcast is we really want to start having conversations with people take this idea where you're over there and you belong over there and I belong over here, and we throw things back and forth at each other, and that applies across politics, that applies across denominations, that applies with the theological beliefs, whether you believe in predestination, God's sovereignty versus, what I'm saying? Like, there's so many things, and culturally...
The facets, if you will.
Yeah.
The little things that we know about people that keep us from having the larger conversation.
Totally. Well, and it's hard because in some ways our brains work against us in this regard, right? Like there's a lot. I mean, I'm a big nerd, so I'm not a scientist, but neuroscience has been a long interest of mine. Sociology and behavioral economics, both interests of mine. So it's sort of one of those things where it's like you learn enough about how people choose to do things and what they choose to do in life, and you go, oh darn, like the deck is stacked against us in a sense. There's this marketing guru named Seth Godin. I don't know if you've heard of him. He has this phrase that kind of boils down so much human behavior. And it's people like us do things like this. And so like at the end of the day, you can pretty accurately predict what a group of people will do if you know what their us is and you know what they think that us is supposed to do.
Sure.
And it's kind of fascinating in a sense. Like I feel like, at least in theory, once upon a time, that us was, hey, we're Christians belonging to the church and belonging to Jesus. And that's how we define our us. So when we approach politics, when we approach municipal issues, when we approach our neighbor, we're approaching as I'm a Christian and a Christian is like. And it feels like that. I mean, Kuyper was talking about this 100 years ago, but it feels like that first us, that first tribal first principle, right, has sort of been replaced by other things, whether it's politics or personal identity or some other allegiance. And Christianity's in there, but it's in there in the soup as opposed to in there as the bowl. Sure. And I think that's really heartbreaking. And I feel like it's a total miss in the church for us to not be really calling people to say, hey, first and foremost, the way of life revealed in the person of Jesus and empowered by the Spirit and in Christ is the first principle from which we go out into the world. And so like even when we were doing unity work, trying to get people from very different denominations to work together, we found centering on the creeds, like the simplest Christian list, to at least kind of get the like, where do we differ off the table? It's like, hey, look, if this is what the church has always said is the list, we're going to use that list so that we can set this topic aside and go do work together. Yeah. And that's what Manifesto was actually. That it was creeds.
Yeah. So good.
No doubt.
You in one of your songs, you say we're looking for a prophet to teach you, a shepherd to lead you, a king to believe in. But isn't that Jesus? And I mean, it's kind of speaking to what you're saying, where we always
looking towards
as
something.
Humans, we tend to do this, and we take our eyes off of the true king and the true kingdom, and we start to replace it with proxies, right? Like, oh, Jesus, Republican, right? Or Baptist, and this is now Jesus. And but this is easier to see. This is easier to wrap my mind around. This is easier to have an allegiance to. But we still call it the kingdom, right?
Oh, totally. Well, and I think behind that too, there's a not to get all heady about it, but there's a healthy degree in which I feel like in Western Christianity, and I only speak it that way because I don't know present day Eastern Christianity well enough, but but within our context, it feels like there's a dualism that has been taken for granted, where we think of the gospel, we think of the Christian faith and the implications of the Christian faith as being primarily spiritual and having little or nothing to do with real life.
Right.
Sure.
Yes.
So the implications of knowing Jesus and having the Holy Spirit are a bunch of esoteric spiritual exercises and or experiences, and that it's primarily about escaping. And I don't see that in the Bible. I don't see that in the Christian story up to up until maybe 150 years ago. And so there is this sense in which the Jewish people were a deeply holistic people. They weren't primarily concerned about the afterlife. They didn't even barely have a theory of the afterlife. So most of the Old Testament, they're all over the place in terms of what happens after you die. So it seems clear to me, at least, that wasn't the primary concern of Jesus as he called his disciples. And, so much of the New Testament is about how do you live? Now, how do you live?
Yeah.
And and I think we've kind of lost a lot of that as the main thrust of what is happening. And so no, if that's the case, then I think it kind of makes sense that people are going to turn to other things to say, well, if Christianity doesn't answer how I should really live, because there are reasons I shouldn't take this teaching or that teaching seriously, then I'm going to look to something else to tell me how I do live, because I do have to go to work. Yeah. I do have to go to the grocery store, and I do have to. So we kind of need to redeem a little bit of that. Like, this is a way. This is the early Christians were called the way. We're following in the footsteps of Jesus. The red letters in the Sermon on the Mount are instructive. Yeah. Not, and really take that to heart. But it feels a little bit like a voice in the wilderness in our current political climate.
To your point about all of that, we're pretty involved. I've been involved in a program called Celebrate Recovery for 15 years, and Mark's been involved for a few years with me, and we love it. And a big reason I love it so much is because it's basically saying this problem of addiction, there is a solution, and it's Jesus, right? And it's basically it's what you're saying. It's taking all of these scriptural truths and saying, now apply it for real here, and apply it for real here, and apply it for real here, and then holding you accountable to that, and living in the reality of what it is to be a Jesus follower who struggles. Because all Jesus followers struggle. You know what I mean? And Jesus' teachings are full of how to live as a broken person, but trying to follow him, And it's not hard to find tools in the Bible for addiction, for whatever it is. So it's been a passion of mine for a long time, because it's kind of putting boots to the ground in terms of what Jesus said versus practical living things out. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Well, and I think with that, like you mentioned the song Kyrie eleison, It's Mercy We Need. So I wrote that with Zach Boland of Citizens, and so Citizens features on the song, and of course that was in response both to my own experiences and his in Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll. So we wrote that song before the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast even came out. My experience had nothing to do with cameras and podcasts, but my youth pastor had similar personality traits. And the reality is, looking back, they're as good and bad in that experience and relationship. I don't want to throw him under the bus. It's not that simple. But the reason that the song, the kind of pretense of the song is It's Mercy We Need, is realizing that on some level, like, personality worship in and of, if we throw all of our eggs in the basket of a human being, that human being will fail us. Yep, sure. There's exactly one who hasn't. And I think and I had the gift of having that man in my life saying all along, don't follow me as I follow Jesus, quoting Paul, of course. Sure. So there is this sense in which, like, we do need that. We need the social interaction. We need that trust to be meaningful. Like, if in Celebrate Recovery, everyone around you failed all of the time and no one actually accomplished what they were trying to do, it wouldn't be a very effective ministry, right? And so it's the same thing. Like, yes, we fail, but we are constantly pulling each other forward because we exist in a community while redirecting. And that's a kind of a two-sided thing that we have to do. And I think we so love personality worship as people. We're drawn to that. And so that, I think there's a reason that at the heart of it all, Jesus essentially calls us to mercy and kindness in the story of the Good Samaritan, in breaking it all down to the Shema and loving God and neighbor, basically the same. There's this sort of like, hey, well, what does kindness mean? Kindness is treating of like kind, right? So there's this sort of like, hey, at the heart of the Christian message is a love that surpasses our failures and surpasses our dividing lines and surpasses our boundaries. And that includes not holding someone up in a place that they can't possibly live up to. Sure.
And it's interesting as you think about that. I think that's what the Sermon on the Mount was. You have been taught, the Pharisees have demonstrated, but I'm showing you, I'm telling you this is what the kingdom is about, you know? And I think,
yeah, totally.
and I think that's what we're talking about, you know, so much of what we believe or tend to think about, we have been taught by someone, you know, who we've held in esteem, whether it's our parents, whether it's a worship leader, whether it's a youth pastor, those kind of things. And it is about that relearning based on, you know, Jesus wanting or deserving even, and being able to extend that mercy to others and to ourselves to say, okay, yeah, this is what you've learned. This is what you've been taught. So it makes perfect sense that you're operating in this way.
Because people us,
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
People like us do things like that, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right. That's right. Yes. And I mean, Christianity is 2,000 years old and as diverse as every nation on the planet. And I'm talking about like basic Orthodox Christianity, not even talking about, you know, all of the various splinter cults that might break off. I mean, like within the confines of genuine, authentic Christian faith, we have a lot of history and a lot of diversity. And so I think, you know, just because someone failed me horribly, and they did, and just because someone bordered on abuse, and I don't know, but you know, it certainly gets close. And so like, just because those things happen doesn't mean that Jesus isn't who he says he is. It means that I've got work to do in understanding and unearthing, in a sense, through history and these ancient writers and current writers, and going, what is it? What's the diamond in the center of all of this coal that just keeps shining through no matter what? And that's, you know, we've talked about this record as like stubbornly hopeful, because that's kind of it. Like, it's not a deconstruction record, so to speak, because if you wanted to describe my spiritual life, that would have happened 20 years ago, and it did, in a sense. Like, trying to figure out what's this or what's that in faith, that's a journey I'm still on. But it certainly is a like, hey, I've been as frustrated and angry, and it's like lament and hope in the same place. We started this record, Brent and I, when we were first talking about it, I was like, I really feel like if I make anything right now, first of all, it was approached as an album, so I appreciated that you listened to it as such, but it was meant to be a journey from start to finish, lyrically, musically, all of it. And so it's sort of this sense in like, I feel like it'd be really hard to put out a worship record right now, or any record that's designed to help people pray prayers through music, and have it not be at least bittersweet.
Yeah.
I don't know how someone living in North America or the West can look at our life as the church right now and not be like, well, this is complicated. Right. I mean, we've got a lot of people angry about a lot of things, and for good reasons. Yeah. And so I think as those of us helping people process that through music and prayer, I just can't imagine having made a record that was, you know, rainbow and sunshines and high fives and unicorns. I don't see it.
Yeah. And those albums certainly exist, but they're kind of disjointed, right? From
it certainly feels like it, but it makes sense if your Christianity is totally divorced from your real life.
Yeah,
sure. That's the place where you go to happy. That's where you go to escape the real world instead of,
like you said, that's where you go to get them.
You do that, and then you walk into your everyday life going rainbows and unicorns, rainbows. And it's like, well,
can you please?
It doesn't seem. My kids already did, I'm sure.
Good. I love you know, because you're saying without you it's smoke and mirrors, only noise, but and that's where that hope comes in. And when I listen to that song, and so much of the album, there's just so many moments where it's like, I'm with you in that pain, but there's always a but, because he doesn't need us culturally to be something. He's going to be what he's going to be, with or without us. So when he does show up, it doesn't matter how wrong we're doing it, right? And so there's something about that for me that's recognized. I'll never do it perfect, because me and my wife, we lead worship at CR, and so there's so many days where I get in my way, in God's way, and I'm like, you know what? I can't fix that 100%. I can work at it, and I can repent. Ultimately, what I really need is I need you to do what you did last week, because that wasn't me. You know what I mean? And so, and there's so many moments where he shows up, and you go, "Ha! Well, that's not me." So I hope you guys are enjoying this. I am, and there's that hope that comes when he does what he does. So I love that balance.
Yeah, well, and it's I think so much of real human life is lived in that tension. It's in the space in between hurt and brokenness and difficulty and all of that, and the ideal good that we know is there. Like we see through a glass darkly, right? But I think there's really something to be said for the beauty of the smallness of what you're talking about in CR.
Yeah, agreed.
Like and there's I think part of why we are so drawn to the idea of mega movements is because they cost us nothing. So easy to wave a flag of belonging to something and maybe give my 5% or 2% or whatever the statistics are, and be like, oh, I'm doing this thing here without having to worry about what Fred next door is doing, or whether I'm kind to him regardless of his choices in life. Whether I show him love.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the shocking things about the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, Jesus is sitting there telling an occupied people, like violently occupied, to love their enemy and carry their bag an extra mile. Now, there are layers to that. That's a nuanced and complicated instruction, but it is also a simple instruction. The simple part of it doesn't change. And I think we've gotten to the point where we've turned our various isms into just another flag that we wave because it's so much easier than doing it. But you go to CR and you're part of this small thing, and you're looking that person in the face. I mean, I remember I used to run an alpha group at years and years ago. I was sort of running it with my friend at a shelter, like a rehab.
Oh, cool.
And so we were doing alpha and leading worship in that same way with guys who were sharing just heartbreaking stories of the cards real life had dealt them. And it's funny, a few years later, I'm on a tour bus touring the world and flying to so-and-so. And I love all of that. I'm not saying it isn't a blast, because it is.
Yeah.
Sure.
But you, I don't know if it's age or what, but you go and you're like, both of those things are good, but one of these things changes the world in 300 years.
Yeah.
And another one of them seems to kind of break every 10.
See, this is what I'm talking about. What I hear in your album is what you're saying. Like, you toured the world, you played in front of whatever, stadiums, auditoriums, and there was a certain amount of impact and significance to that I think you probably experienced. I would hope, right? Where it's this is amazing.
I feel like it mattered. I don't, but it did.
Right. At the same time, you get further along in your life, you've had enough one-on-one counseling sessions, or you heard someone's story come from a broken place, and you're like, this thing matters.
Yeah.
More than all of that. Is like,
or heck, I've had to go to therapy myself. I mean, there's all of that. Like, there's enough real life as you get on, and my kids are teenagers, and so my own failings, and I don't mean my kids' failings, I mean my own failings as a parent, stare me in the face every day, where they're like, hey, you're not all you want to be cracked up to be, and I'm like, that's totally fair. So I think there's something as you get older where you just go, I'm as earnest as I ever was. I think probably more earnest. I'm less afraid of losing influence or something like that, because I'm just like, at the end of the day, you need to know who your friends are. You need to know who your people are. You need to know what's important to you, and try your darndest to do it empowered by the Spirit. And I would love. At this point, I'm hoping for my kids' adulthood, them thinking, you know what, Dad wasn't perfect, but he gave it a solid go.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, no doubt.
That would be okay by me. That's a successful
that'd be a
run.
pass.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I love hearing a perspective from someone like you who has toured and done those things, and has kind of come back to this place of, you know, what probably matters more than that stadium room. God could have done something in any one of those stadiums, and that is, you know, like, of course. But recognizing that I could walk across the street and talk to my neighbor, and the 300 years from now, that could have a bigger impact, right? Is what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, like last night, my wife and I are walking. So this is not to say I'm some kind of hero. Far from it. My wife was the hero in this scenario. Hamilton is a rough city, so we're walking, you know, from our parking spot to the theater where we went to see a musical. And two homeless guys, younger guy, both on something, and the younger guy's just beating the snot out of the older guy, and my wife jumps in and says, "Hey, what are you guys doing? It's okay, you got to stop." And I'm jumping in the same way, and it dawned on me. And so the guy comes right up to us, is talking, and we called the police shortly afterwards. It's just this like little like, I could have not done any of that.
Yeah.
I could have done more than I did. I could have done a lot less. But it's like those little choices. We encounter them all of the time.
Right.
All of the time.
Right.
And that has nothing at all to do with, you know, my guitar amp.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing to do with it. That's not to say that's not meaningful.
Right.
Those moments together, that sort of fuels the rest of it. But it isn't the point at all. And so that you kind of get this, like, Jesus is saying, hey, the crowds aren't evil. It's not like and we have a tendency to kind of go black or white in this.
Yes,
it's like,
sure.
It's all about small groups and home church. Well, problem is the early church went to the temple too. So you kind of have this history doesn't agree with it's all about home church. And then you have this kind of, it's all about the big meeting. Well, that doesn't work either, because all of the instructions we have are about lived life. And so you have this kind of tension. I think this, and we want it to be a very simple answer. And Jesus gives us that. He says the first principle of Christianity is love the Lord your God in every domain in your life. And just like that, love your neighbor.
Sure.
And that's it. That's you want a simple version of Christianity. Yeah. It's there. Yeah. And it isn't win at a political issue. It isn't power at all costs. In fact, if anything, it looks like the opposite of power at all costs. But like, you know, it's kind of this pursue these two things. And I think there's a role to be played in podcasts and concerts and albums and all of that. But for the longest time, I concerned myself in music with what sort of music it was I was writing. Was it congregational worship music or not? And that sort of thing. And I think on this record, I've become a little more comfortable with the idea that there's a little bit of that on the record. There's probably 3 or 4 songs that would make great worship songs at church. But a lot of what I do is for the rest of the week.
Sure.
You know, and it's not really for the purposes of entertainment, although it is entertaining, hopefully. But it's really like me processing my following, good and bad, out loud, in the hopes of giving somebody else the ability to, whether it's on their run or their morning walk or whatever, you know, to do the same thing and have language that they didn't have to do that. That's kind of what we do as worship writers, you know?
Yeah.
So this record does have a bit more of like an artistic and I don't know, vulnerable flair to it than worship records can, and certainly than I've been able to produce at different times. So, yeah.
No, and like you say, I'm definitely not steeped in worship nearly as much as Justin is.
Okay.
Well, no, and that's a compliment, you know, to have that being so much of your life. You know, you're immersed in it to a degree, and that's a great thing. But it was definitely for me, you know, from the outside listening to your album, I appreciated the way, I guess my wife and I, whenever we go somewhere to worship, you know, corporately, you know, we just appreciate so much when there is a vocabulary that draws us, you know, towards Christ and who God is versus the me worship style that, you know, repeats what I am and how God can help me versus how me focusing on God and drawing close to him transforms me. And, you know, and I think so much of that is that difference between entertainment and worship. you know, and I think that becomes, you know, there again, there's that tension.
It is, and that's what I was gonna say is like, I think the reality is though that's a tension. So what often worship leaders will do is make that into a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
They'll say, oh, I can't write a song with personal pronouns in it. It all has to be talking to God. The problem is the vast majority of Christian history used the Psalter as the worship book of the ages.
Sure.
And you know, were we to make that a hard and fast rule? We only talk to God, never about ourselves. We don't celebrate anything God has done for us. We only celebrate who God is. You'd fail the Bible.
Yeah.
So if the songbook of the Bible can't pass that rule, it's a good reminder.
Sure.
Of that rule.
No doubt.
That's kind of the thing that tension is there. And worship leaders are so often drawn to the simplest version of it so they can move on.
Sure.
And I think that's something that I don't think following Jesus allows us to do very easily is move on to the next thing we can be victorious over. Doesn't it you know what Eugene Peterson called it a long walk in the same direction, right? So it's that kind of like, so much of Christian faith is showing up again. Like CR.
Sure.
It's showing up again.
Yeah.
And being like, hey, today this is what it means for me to be faithful in this. And so that's part of one of the dilemmas in kind of, I don't want to I'm not calling anyone in particular out, but this occasional tendency to like almost like a toxic positivity in worship. Like the only songs we sing are victorious over all of our problems and Jericho's walls fell down. And it's just like, sometimes the wall's just still there.
But there's also this other side where it's all about the drama and how hard life is, and Jesus can get you through, but it's still it's focused on the difficult. It's kind of the opposite of what you're saying. Focused on positivity or whatever. There's also a focus on negativity, and
exactly
those draw me in more than the positivity ones. Those tie into my struggle with mental health and different things, and those can. And it is a tension. It is a balance because sometimes that's what I need to hear. I need someone to meet me where I am, right? And same with the they both are needed. I think this is a conversation I had recently with my wife too about denominations and different churches, and I think you and I talked about it too. Is there's a reason there's a Baptist church and our church and this other Baptist church all within 5 miles, and it's because God said it was supposed to be that way. And he wanted this person here and this person here and this person here because that's what they needed. That in his sovereignty and his wisdom chose it. And I think that's true with music. I think that's true with so many things. And one of the things we've figured out with polarization in these conversations is that's the easy part, is saying, oh, I'm black or I'm white. And problem solving, like you said, now I can move on to the next problem. When it's, as believers, like you said, if we're doing number 1 and number 2 right, love God, love people, oftentimes those things take us away from that, because
and there's a couple of fascinating things I think with that. First, there's a few studies called Dunbar's number, which has come out, which is talking about how much the brain's capacity for community size. You heard of this?
No.
So this is a study that's been debated, and the thing is, everyone comes to a number, and that number is never 1,000. Let me just put it that way. So Dunbar's first theory was 125.
Okay.
So the brain basically has capacity for around 125, where we can remember community connectors. And of that, we have 15 that dictate 90% of our life and time. And of that, we have like 3 to 5, which dictate 90% of that. So it's like you have a small group of people, which are relationships you can count on one hand, who are the real people. Then you have about 15 people that are your wider circle. And then you have about 125 people. And no matter what else you're doing, that's about what you have in terms of meaningful relationships. And that kind of rings true for most people, I think. There's sort of this sense of like, I guess there might be contextual relationships. There might be, but if someone at the end of their life is, very few funerals have 1,000 people at them. And so like there's this kind of bonded thing. And I think like we tend to think larger than that while still doing small in that sense, right? Like we still do that 125 people thing. So it's no surprise that humans organize and divide. The question is, when you have that thing happening, is there a layer above it which we recognize as bonding us and binding us together? And so that's like, yes, you have the Methodist Church, you have the Baptist Church, you have the Catholic Church, you have whatever Anglican church down the road. The question is, do we all say, and we have Jesus in common?
Mm-hmm.
And approach each other as brothers and sisters on mission together as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important facet that I'm grateful to have grown up in a city where that was the norm.
Mm.
And that's a very rare thing. And I'll be honest, today, it feels like it's a struggle to keep in Hamilton. It feels different than it did. It's hitting less hard than it did, as far as I can tell. But it's still, that desire is still there because we've seen it firsthand here. So there is that there. I think with the music thing too, and I kind of get it from a songwriting standpoint. You've got a group of people, you've got a community of people, and you got 100. Let's say you're at a small church of 100, you're at a big church of 600. Doesn't really matter, right? You're at a church of 10,000. I don't know, and you want everyone to come in to Sunday morning and relate to something so that they can be invested and be fully holistically invested in what's happening together in corporate worship. So that's a good goal. It's a noble goal. And so I think that naively what sometimes happens is writers and songwriters and worship leaders or pastors will say, okay, what we need to do is use averaging language. We need to use the stuff that is safely universal. But the problem is that that's often dehumanizing. We take the things that people can actually relate to out of it, and we give them almost nothing to relate
Platitudes.
to. Platitudes, right. Whereas, like, the studies are showing, for example, that people who are angry find angry music more cathartic and more therapeutic than calming music. That, listening to Muzak and elevator music when you're angry makes you more angry. So there is something to, like, everyone. You don't need to have been to New York to hear a song about New York and get it.
Yeah.
There's something in, like, I have a street just like that.
Yeah.
There's a city just, I can relate to that specific experience. I mean, it's Psalm 2 before Zion, which is a very particular, is mentioned. Like, the Psalms don't dodge the specific.
Sure.
And it's often those specific things that we grab. And so as you're talking about, like, humanity and music and feeling like, hey, I often gravitate towards the stuff that seems hurtful, avoiding that stuff actually doesn't make that stuff go away.
Right.
And if anything, it actually makes people feel like the gap and divorce between the Christian life and what it's required to participate in the Christian life and their real life is wider and wider and wider and wider.
Sure.
Because now they're not allowed to have any negative emotions in the process.
Yeah.
And we all have.
Yeah.
So I think there's really, I don't know that I'm succeeding, but I'm certainly trying my best to go, hey, look, I'm going to try to more and more write vulnerable, honest, human worship songs.
Sure.
And I hope that calls us to more. I hope that calls us to Christ-like living. But I don't read scriptures. I don't read Paul. I don't read David and Jesus and see at the end of that we're called to deny being human through it.
Yeah.
Is not that what the Psalms are about, really, when you stop and think about it? The diversity.
Yeah.
One chapter, it's like, God, you're the only thing. And then the next, it's like, God, how'd you do this?
Yeah, and also, like, how many heads can I chop off? Like,
That's
Psalms is all over the place.
Yes,
exactly.
It is.
And it is just the case that our songbooks aren't now.
Yeah.
Psalms is not neutered, to your point.
No.
Like, it is very raw, very visceral
And
in all of David's life.
Isn't that what made him a man after God's own heart? Was that authenticity that we're actually talking about? Is that ability to say, okay, God, this is where I'm at, but you know that.
Yeah. And culturally, you're talking about people who personality worship, that whole idea. And I think probably all of us have, I know for sure you had a personality like that in your life. I certainly did. So, in fact, listening to Mark Driscoll reminds me of him so much. And I think the beauty of it is that God uses that stuff as well. And I think it's spun off this version of culture now where there is some disenfranchisement. That's not good. But there's also a desire and a seeking of authenticity, which is good. you know, and to where there's space for an album like yours. There's space for being real and not having this perfectly packaged CCM, you know, album, but reality is in the mix, and there's a longing for that, a desire for that, and I think and that's not just the Christian culture, right? Authenticity is more and more desired and appreciated. You know, you think about 50, 60 years ago where you wanted a professional to help you, someone who knew what they were doing, they could talk above you, so you trusted them. Okay, I trust you, you know what you're doing, you're smart. And now it's kind of the opposite, where trust comes when I know you're real. And that cultural shift has happened in, I want to say, the last 20 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And that obviously bled into the church. And chicken or egg, you know, the whole Mark Driscoll, that personality worship, which came first? Was that us doing it first? I kind of don't think so. I kind of think we were modeling the world, you know, and saying, oh, that works over there, let's do that here too. I don't know, but it could be the other way, and it doesn't matter.
In a lot of ways, the phenomenon that drives, I think, the phenomenon that drove Mars Hill and a million other people like Mark, and the phenomenon that drives vanilla positivity Christian songwriting, which we're all, you know, prone to fall into as writers, is the same. I don't know if this is too crass, but like, it's like the pornification of everything.
Yeah.
We want the shortcut to the illusion of the thing without having to do or experience any of the awkward real parts of there.
Right.
You know? And so it's like, so someone like Mark Driscoll being allowed opinionated caricature, which has parallels in other spaces in life, but nevertheless, having that kind of personality to live vicariously through means I don't have to. As long as I agree with his vicarious loudness, then I can sort of have to it, and it's like, no, but I'm with him and he's really doing it. Just look over there. and there's the same thing with music, where it's like, oh no, I'm for 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes, I'm victorious and peppy, and I feel that. And it's not to discount that can happen, that those songs really can be a moment for somebody that spins them into something. Of course that can happen. I'm not saying that can't. It's just that can't be it. These moments need to be springboards that lead us to, I mean, the album is called The Work for a reason. I mean, these are springboards to doing the work of living faithful life. I mean, every song we ever write as a worship writer is part of liturgy. Even if we don't call it that, even if we don't recognize that, we should feel the weight of knowing we're competing with Cranmer. So like we're in there doing the real thing of helping people pray prayers. And if we don't feel that weight, then we're not paying attention. And the word liturgy is the work of the people. These songs are fuel for lived life. They are not a 4-minute distraction or a setup for a bad stand-up comic on a Sunday. That's not the vibe. We are doing discipleship in these songs, you know?
Yeah.
And I hope that we all recognize that. I certainly am trying to increasingly myself, and feel weighed down in a sense by who do I think I am, you know, speaking of Mark Driscoll. But like that sense of like, the work of living this thing and doing the long, slow, hard work of living it out is different from simply appreciating it for 4 minutes at a time. It's just not the same thing. Yeah. One leads to the other. It doesn't automatically mean it happens, you know? And I think that's just been such a, and I can't even say I'm nailing it right now. I'm kind of in this space myself where with the chaos of moving country and everything else, where my personal discipline of prayer isn't what I would like it to be perfectly honest. It has been, of course, but you know, if I think of this last month, it's like my life is chaos right now.
Sure.
You know? And so much of, I think, I don't know if it's maturing or what, or growing, it's like, you know what, it's not that I think God doesn't care. It's that I don't want to be motivated simply by guilt. There's a difference between discipline and relationship, and like, this is the, you know? And so I'm kind of in this space of finding moments where I get them in trying to be with Jesus in a simple, you know, childhood sense. And and I'm grateful for that. But at the same time, I also know, like, hey, life is hard sometimes and busy and crazy. And, you know, I think so much of what I need to be doing and need to be focusing on is living lovingly. And that means centering in who God is and also loving my neighbor well.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's work.
It's, agreed. If you don't mind, there's a couple lyrics I want to talk about. Or,
sure, great.
Or phrases, I should say. The first one I want to talk about. So my favorite worship leader is my wife. She's taught me everything, and I just love her heart when it comes to worship. And Mark, would you agree? Yeah.
She's awesome. Your favorite? Yes, I'd agree. She's your favorite in more ways than one.
Pretty strange if he cut you. I was like, that's not true at all. That's not.
Anyway, there's a lot of things that we've talked about over the years, but one of the things she has talked about is how much she appreciates O's, ahs, or even like Manifesto, amen, right? Like those elongated opportunities to worship without having to have words, because there's something in it. And I think she would describe it like the Bible talks about the wordless groans. Like the Holy Spirit will speak for us in ways that we can't understand. So in some ways it's this singing prayer of, I don't know, but kind of. I'd love to get your take on that. On
Dude,
O's.
I can get real geeky if you want.
Please do.
So one of the fascinating things in the last 15 years with how much neuroscience has developed and evolved is we can see that group singing, so people singing out loud together, has a physiological effect that rivals practically every group activity except for sex.
Wow.
So like there is this like this, so when you sing in a group, fundamentally basic human thing in most cultures. So when you sing in a group, your brain produces huge amounts of a hormone called oxytocin, which is sometimes called the love hormone. Mm-hmm. And it's the same hormone that a mother is flooded with when she breastfeeds for the first time, same hormone when your elbows touch at the movies on your first date. It's that bonding agent that kind of does the thing. So just the practice of singing on a material level does something in us as humans. And what's crazy is just a few years ago, University of Bonn in Germany showed that oxytocin, one of the byproducts of oxytocin, is altruism. So let's go back to Matthew 22 for a second. Love the Lord your God with your whole self, your body, all of these things. So dopamine and oxytocin, both produced by group singing. Your body's enthralled. You're bonded with the people around you. You're bonded with your community just in the act of group singing, right? And then apparently you're also, at least in some way, fueled to love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
Sure.
So that just in the act of group singing, a little bit of Matthew 22 is taking place.
Right.
No doubt.
Which is, I think, really crazy. Because I know there's a lot of people a lot of Christians will, treat science as a toss away. I'm not one of them. I'm really into it. But the reality is, I think it's remarkable that God gave us brains and bodies to use, and again, to our point about being holistic as opposed to divide lives, is like, it seems like God baked in some of these things that Christian tradition discovered and has done, and Christianity has always been a singing faith for a reason.
Sure.
It's amazing. And this is just one example of hundreds of thousands I'm sure we've come up with over our collective existence as humans, to see there was a reason for that, and seeing science catch up. And Mark and I had an episode recently about creationism versus evolution, that whole thing, because again, very polarized, right? Even within Christian culture, there's polarized views between what creationism is, right? And but that was one of the themes, was just talking about science and how we don't have to be there's this tendency to be afraid of science if you, depending on what cultural situation you grew up in,
what you were taught.
Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, big time.
yeah, like you said, we don't have to be afraid of it. Instead, it's exciting. It should be, because it's just going to show more and more of his plan and his creativity. And anyway, that's really cool.
And I think it's interesting because, I mean, realistically, all truth is God's truth.
Yes.
You know, what, depending on when we find it out. So, you know, the fact that we're singing together, or the fact that we're even singing, puts it in our brain in such a way that we don't have to memorize these long, you know, I think of Old Testament, you know, that memorization that could go along with song, that the minute I hear that song, it all comes to my mind. I don't have to recite it as a pledge.
Totally.
And I think, you know, that connection is just fascinating, how God has baked in that ability. And, you know, there is a purpose in worship, whether we know all of those purposes yet or not,
right.
But yet even the little parts that we become aware of through science make, yeah, God, you did, this is.
I think we're complicated people. We have emotions. We have all of these things. And I think the tendency in Christian faith is like, no, emotions bad, reason good. Well, we learn enough to know that's not simple either. And so it's like you kind of get in this like, well, it turns out that there's something to be said for the whole person coming to bear in prayer. And that means, you know, emotions and all the rest of it. And so I think that there's really something beautiful in that. You know,
no doubt.
We can see how the whole music does things to the whole person in a unique way. And it makes an activity more than a solitary individualistic exercise. It makes it a shared communal experience. You know, you could talk about flow state. You could talk about the fact that group singing aligns heartbeats. I mean, it goes on. It is the craziest. The science around group singing is the craziest stuff, I think, for thinking about what it means to, and why it's such a big part of what we do to get. You know?
So good.
Yeah.
I feel like you're avoiding the O question.
No, I mean, I think I didn't the answer. I didn't the answer. What? This is part of the thing. It's like there's something to simply the act of singing together that is beautiful and impactful. So the O's and ahs and all of that are super helpful. Anyone can wrap their head around it, and they can go there with you. I think it's a good thing. Now, sometimes what'll happen is you'll get guys who kind of like, oh, well, all worship songs should be like the old hymns, which are really and theologically dense. And there is something to be said for content and quality. I do think that's good. But again, we're talking about human beings. We're not simply having people sing the dictionary or the phone book. It's like we're human beings, and there's a give and take. There's tension and release in that. And I think, so for me, I've tended towards verses which are punch, 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 and then choruses which allow people to breathe.
Yeah.
It's like a good movie in my mind. There's tension and release. There's build and there's breathe in and breathe out, breathe in and breathe out. And I think so much of those moments, those O's and ahs and you know, those kind of big soaring moments are really about that. It's like, okay, you've been chewing, now swallow. Let's move on.
Nice.
You know, that kind of thing.
Sure.
The other lyric I want to reference is "Holy is the Lord," because this is like, I don't know if you knew this, you probably did, but that's probably the most common phrase across all of your, you know, including City Harmonic, and I love it because, you know, Revelations talks about that's what the four living creatures. I wrote this down. Each of them with 6 wings are full of eyes all around within, day and night. They never cease to say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." It's this idea that you can say this for infinity, and it's never enough. But anyway, I wanted to get your take on that. Did you know that? I assume you did.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, from start to finish. I think one of the things that has stood out to me for a long time, and get real esoteric here if we want, but is like the idea that the word holy essentially means, like, yes, set apart, but set apart as other. So there's sort of this like unlikeness. And so you have this really fascinating thing where the holy, the unlike, makes human beings and makes us in his image. So there's this kind of strange like but unlike thing happening. And so it kind of makes sense then that there's this theological idea called participation. which is common in Greek Orthodox circles. The Eastern Church has been into this forever. But it's the idea that like we as believers, and the question in theological circles has been, to what extent does Paul take for granted the theology of participation in his own soteriology and theology? So it's that kind of like participation being that the church, people participate in the church and the church participates in the body of Christ. So that language is very consistent in, throughout all of Paul. And so if you're looking at holy is the Lord, how does a holy God relate to his creation if we are both like and unlike God? And so it kind of forces us to come face to face with the idea of being made like God. Now, not in some crazy sense. I mean, that's the thing. We're called to be little Christs. That's the whole. So there is this tension in God is holy, therefore I am pulled into holiness self throughout the whole scope of my life, throughout every sphere of my life. It's again not an exercise which occurs as a means of like, oh, wouldn't it be lovely if things were holy? It's a calling unto holiness. And so even they that sing is the song you're talking about. And it's a song that kind of marries the science of singing we were just talking about from this old, probably misattributed Augustine quote for, he that sings praise twice. But it is the idea that like there's something in singing that emboldens and bolsters the power of prayer in our own experience and our own lives. I think that's true. And so like in that singing, there's something happening in our whole bodies. And from that comes this song that in the second verse of that song leads into every other domain of our lives because it goes into Matthew 22. Holy is the Lord. So what does it mean to sing holy? Well, it means to be holy is the Lord. In every domain of our lives. So that's really what that song's trying to get to very simply. It's sort of one of the few very congregational, very sort of meditative songs. It repeats itself, which there isn't a lot of on this record, but that song is one of them.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that one. I like that line too. I didn't know it was Augustine or whatever, but just the idea that I was telling him.
He sings praise twice.
Yeah, he that sings praise twice so many times in worship. It's prayer, but it's like enhanced prayer essentially. So it's like 2x prayer essentially. Yep. So
absolutely. Well, you set a rhythm to it, and you give people a cadence to follow, and the idea of praying together is a lot easier.
Yeah,
no doubt. How many times do you find yourself humming the prayer you said in your closet in the morning versus the prayer that you said with other people in the midst of a congregation? That's what continues in your mind.
That's good.
In the process, yeah.
Ooh, yeah, it sticks.
Exactly. Yes. Unfortunately for some of us, it's the same 5 words that stick over and over and over again. But you know,
sing those 5 words so well. It's very
oh my gosh, that's great.
I'd love to. I'm glad you talked a little bit about City Harmonic. I wasn't sure how all that went down in terms of like the shift from that to solo.
Oh, it was totally healthy.
Yeah, that's amazing.
We're still friends. We're planning a barbecue in a couple weeks.
Cool. Nice.
There's nothing. Eric had cancer, and he fought cancer for 3 years. Wow. Came back after 2 years, and after a year of touring, realized he couldn't anymore. And the rest of us were like, well, let's keep trying, and sort of decided, you know what, we're a band, and we need to close the book. I mean, I often compare it to, there's a very particular sitcom that takes place in a workplace where there was originally a British version and then there was an American version. The British version was 2 seasons, I think, maybe? And it was great.
Do you know what show he's talking about?
No, but that's okay.
Is it okay if we say it?
Oh, yeah, well, I don't care.
I was just trying to figure it out while he gave more and more of the story. Keep going.
You look at The Office.
Yes, The Office.
The UK version of The Office was crass at times, but it knew exactly what it was doing. It was tightly packaged, and they ended when they needed to end. The American Office was 9 seasons, of which 3 were great. So it's like, 60% of what they did was kind of wasting everybody's time to keep going because they could, because it was making money. And I think of that as like a metaphor for creative projects. It's like, I could just do this because I could.
Yeah.
City Harmonic could have continued because it was practical to do so, because it paid our bills. But we started as a band on mission. We were commissioned by 30-odd churches to go out and do what we did.
Wow.
And rather than just ride off into the sunset slowly while everyone got bored of us, we called it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you ever
Something to be
tempted
said
to
for
get?
that.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. Yeah. Are you ever tempted to get together to just do something? I don't know.
Eric
Have
and
a
I
barbecue.
Musically. Yes.
I don't think that the band as a whole will reunite musically. No, not for any, particularly. I just don't. Everyone's moved on in their lives, I think. But Eric is still full-time in music. I'm still very focused on music. So it's a big part of our lives. Eric co-wrote the song Fire and Ice on this record.
Okay.
So we did that. And so that's still part of, we're still, I had lunch with him last week. So we're still very.
Yeah.
Is he in remission? Or is he
he's on the other side of it.
Wonderful.
That's awesome.
But with complications, of course, that it will probably, he has a liver disorder, for example, as a result of it, that'll probably never
Oh, wow.
never go away. So there's stuff like that. But no, I mean, he's on the other side of it, and life is good.
Glad to
That's
hear
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, Manifesto is a favorite. I think probably of pretty much anyone who's heard of them, but heard of you guys. But Holy Wedding Day, man, that song punches me every time I hear it. Like at the end, I don't know. It's such a great. We were talking about holy is the Lord, right? And singing at that revelation end times, when we get to all go up there, that song is very much painting a beautiful picture of that. And
Yes.
yeah, it's such a great song. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, like just whatever what
Yeah.
caused you to write it.
I think so. So one of the things that sort of started my theological exploration journey 20 years ago was first encountering N.T. Wright, the theologian out of the UK, who I'm a huge fan of. And he talks a lot about how we often reduce Christianity to going to heaven when we die, as opposed to this marriage of heaven and earth and Jesus and the bride, which is what we see in Revelation. And so in I think it's Revelation chapter 3 or 4, but the picture that's painted of the angels singing Holy, Holy, we often read that as like only future tense. It's like, oh, this is what it will be like. Whereas that section of Revelation is actually saying, this is what it is already and always like.
Yeah.
And then there are other sections of Revelation, of course, 21, for example, that are pointing to new heavens and new earth and this reality of creation redeemed and lives redeemed and the cities redeemed and this kind of city of God being the new lived reality centered in and around Jesus. And so that song is a really thick metaphor. So there's sort of this like, there's the church and there's the bride and the groom, of course, the church and Jesus, which I thought the idea of the church as the bride of Christ was really universal. Like I thought everybody knew that.
Yeah.
At least youth pastors and pastors.
Yeah.
And then we played an event, and a youth pastor, we went into a Wendy's to grab a snack after a show, and the youth pastor called us aside in front of their whole youth group and was like, "Hey, who's the bride?" And they were totally serious. I was like, "Oh, I thought this was like a thing, that everyone knew."
Yeah.
So anyway, the bride refers to the church, and it's that same thing of kind of, this is the story of the Son of God dying on it. It's sort of this contrasting between, you have heard it said, but I think it's more like this.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what that song is doing. Again, wrapping around worship. We don't worship to escape. We worship because God is doing something amazing in our midst.
Right now.
Right now.
Not for the future, but including the future.
Which
Yes,
is
exactly.
which is his. I mean, the kingdom is a big part of your music and the new album. Like his kingdom is something we talk about a lot too. His kingdom is not then later heaven. His kingdom is now. It's not, it's full form, right? Like you said, the new city of Jerusalem. Like when that whole thing happens, there will be no denying his kingdom.
Right.
But his kingdom never stopped. Like
Right.
and
Yeah.
we're
It's
in it.
what's the language of the now but not yet, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's, I guess, like, not to beat a dead horse at this point, but like I think that's the reality of what we've talked about this whole time. It's like the reality is you can't go beyond the surface of Christian thinking and not end up with tension really quick.
Sure.
Because certain fundamental things within Christianity are like the now but not yet. We live as if, knowing it isn't, and it is.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And that's like the basic Christian instruction. How does that make sense? Well, it kind of does and kind of doesn't. Like you're living into a realized future in the person of Jesus and in the mission and story and work of God in the world. And that is not a simple thing.
Right.
It's a
No doubt.
beautiful thing.
Right.
It is a robust thing. It's a song we all want to hear. But if you try to break it down to ABCs, you're going to struggle.
Sure.
That's the thing about so much theology, right? It is meat that can only be chewed once, having matured in your faith long enough to actually have experienced the truth of that theology, and then be able to look at it and go, oh, it's that. Oh, you know.
Totally. Yeah.
And it's that love in action. You know,
Yes.
we can become paralyzed, if you will, to a certain degree by that tension.
Right.
So therefore, what do I do? Well, in love, I will continue to move, and in God's grace, you know, He's gonna overcome my failures because of who He is. But yet, as I continue to strive, as I'm drawn towards Him, you know, in that growth, I am exhibiting my love for Him and His love for me and love for others around, you know.
Exactly. I honestly don't, and I wrestle with this, and that's part of the lament of this record, I guess. Is I don't know how you can spend a lifetime or a decade in scripture, in theology, reading authors old and new in the church, and not come away as you get older and older in life of going, I need to be more kind than I was yesterday.
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know how, and yet we have obvious examples of people doing that. Maybe, what did C.S. Lewis say? People, he was talking about artists and poets, but I think it's true of preachers a lot these days. People who fall out of love with the thing and only in love with their telling of it.
Sure.
So good.
And I think there's in theology and in art, there's absolutely that's a temptation for all of us who feel a creative impetus. It's like, it's my role to say it, so I have to come up with some new way of saying it. Otherwise, I'm plagiarizing or whatever else. It's like, you know, at the end of the day, I don't know how you can spend so much time in this. Jesus, and not come away going, there are fewer hills to die on. There are some hills.
Sure.
But there are fewer hills to die on than there were when I was 19.
Yeah.
And the result of that is that I ought to be kinder through the midst of people working it out, and kinder to people who are getting it wrong, and kinder to people. I mean, Paul outright says, "Who are we to judge the world?" We have enough to work on in the church.
Sure.
So it's like, I think we've often got the playbook backwards, where we're like, we have the answers, we're going to hit you over the head with them, and we're going to put all of the energy of the church into judging the world. And I just look at this, I think, Paul tells us outright, don't do that. So there's that. But then on top of it all, it's like, I don't know how you can spend more time in this and not lead with love and kindness and mercy. I don't see it.
Just beautiful.
No doubt.
There's something to age.
There is,
right?
No doubt.
Yeah. There's some things you can not gain any other way, but just live
awareness.
another day and then another year and then
Yeah.
TikTok. Tell me about TikTok. First of all, I love your videos. That was that's what got my brain ticking about. We need to get him on here because I loved your thoughts on worship.
Yeah, we actually that was my first introduction to you. Right. By all means, I just said, "Hey, check this out." Because we were talking about worship. We did a podcast on worship and what it means, you know, and so that was my first introduction to you. Was on TikTok, and it was That
might have been your first introduction to TikTok.
Quite possibly. Yes, short of a pop-up here or there or something, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah.
No, I of course, I think I mentioned earlier, I've owned a marketing agency forever and ever, so that's a big part of my life. So social media, I'm very aware of and kind of trying to keep and approach it in a healthy way as best I can. I could probably go on TikTok and Instagram and just play guitar a bunch of times, and I do a little bit of that. But I think I also realized so in a lot of ways, so much of the conversation around worship is centered around commercial interest. In other words, like the conferences are organized by people who own the publishing companies who write the songs. And I'm not shooting this down. I've benefited from this. So I can't bite the hand that feeds me, so to speak. But it's sort of, because of how people are, tends to kind of collect around like 4 church groups and some association with those 4 church groups. And I think one of the beauties of TikTok in particular, and Instagram Reels, in as much as they've copied TikTok, is that it is remarkably good at building communities out of interest rather than just building communities out of existing communities. So Facebook and TikTok are opposites. Facebook was, here's your group, now you can be your group here. Yeah. And every once in a while there'd be cross-pollination. You'd maybe join a Facebook group or something like that. But Facebook was never designed to grow and create communities. Facebook algorithmically was designed to monetize communities. TikTok is the opposite. TikTok actively takes creator input and finds other people who like that input. And so a big part of what I've been trying to do is I talk about worship a lot, because I'm like, hey, look, I know I'm a weird cat in our space. I'm really into science. I'm really into behavioral economics and sociology, and I'm really into theology. I'm just kind of an overthinking geek. And so when it comes to my approach to worship, I do sometimes end up taking a position that surprises people who've been in this a lot. Because I'm kind of like, well, I know that we heard that before, but A, it's not in the Bible, and B, science doesn't back it up. So how are we going to talk about this? There's, and I kind of try to, and I don't, not to dismiss anybody. Most of the people doing worship stuff are my friends. I mean, I go on, I talk to them, hang out, we have coffee. That's my life. So, but I come at it from an angle of somebody who this entire time has had my foot in the world. I've been running a company for 15 years that's, helping someone figure out how to find other toffee lovers. I mean, that's a part of what I've been doing this whole time. And I think when you approach ministry and faith and that sort of thing with that, you end up with a different perspective.
No doubt.
Yes. And so in TikTok, I think I've been bringing that to the table, and I've had some unique experiences, I guess, that have given me a slightly different take on some things, and I'm really loving and encouraged by the response. I mean, it really has been a really fast-growing community for me. And
That's cool.
Grateful.
I love it. I've been sharing it with all kinds of people, so that's probably just you're welcome.
It's just you.
You thought it was TikTok's algorithms.
Yeah,
there you go.
It's just you.
Yeah. I want to start wrapping it up. I just have one last thing. Get your take on. Performance versus worship, which we talked a lot about this, and so you might not have to say that much. And this isn't really related, but I'm going to try and make it related. But the idea of song burnout, and I know you have dealt with this more than I, because you go on tour and you play the same song in the same way every single night. I guess I'm just curious how you deal with song burnout, like what your thoughts are on that, and then how you separate performance from worship, and is performance okay? And that's oh no! I hit the play button on my keyboard and started playing your song. So
I'm gonna two-part it. First of all, the performance and worship thing, because I think one informs the other.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. Performance is okay. I don't know how you, as a human being, approach an activity you have done before and not learn from what you did last time. So on some level, you will inevitably perform when you lead worship. Inevitably. It is not going to not happen. What's fascinating is that the word itself, performo in Latin, is church Latin. It's compound Latin. And it means to form thoroughly.
So when you're working as a builder, you get better at nailing the nail with the hammer. When you start out, you hit your thumb, you do. The thing is, it's completely authentic to hit your thumb with a hammer.
Sure.
So if it's just about authenticity in the moment as opposed to authenticity in the lived life, then performance is the devil. But if authenticity is more than that 3-minute window where you're singing that song, but it's instead who you are becoming, who you have been, who you are when you leave, who you are when you turn around. If that's what authenticity is, right? It's more about living in accordance with your values and your desired character or your desired persona, if you will.
Integrity.
If that's what authenticity is, then performance is a non-issue.
Sure.
Because on some level, the beef between worship and performance, so to speak, is actually a beef about momentary authenticity and personality consistency.
Sure.
But the problem is that you go to work and you have a different working relationship with your peers than you do with your kids. And that's good, healthy, and important. Which one of those is the real you? So I think we have this strange cultural hang-up around authenticity that has more to do with how we've come to understand the word as a subtext rather than what it has the potential to mean in our lives, which is that we are true to our true north.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so,
it's interesting you bring that up though, because even when we are in that true north, we become more like what we call isomorphic process, to where our relationships become the same, and there isn't that incongruity.
That is born of habit, isn't it? It's born more of habit than simple choice.
Sure.
It's not as simple as saying, I'm going to now, and then I do. We all know, you guys working with CR, you know full well, that is not how it works. Desire matters, but desire alone does not answer the question.
Sure.
Habit matters. And so, to that end, one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard on performance was in an article, an interview with a classic female singer, I think from the 50s and 60s kind of thing. And they were saying the same question. How do you show up every day and sing the song like it matters? Right? And I think in my mind, there's two things that play out. One, the worship leader and the congregant have utterly different lives. You are not showing up on Sunday as a mom of 5 and ready to go. Step one. So worship leaders lead with their banger all the time. It's a huge mistake. The first 2 songs, all you're doing at best is getting everybody comfortable. That's it. If you expect more than that in the first 2 songs, good luck to you, sir. But it's those first 2 songs are trying to get mom to stop feeling guilty for swatting the kid on the butt to get out the door. Like that's just human life, right?
Sure.
And so on some level, that what the singer was talking about was like so much of what needs to happen is in the moment taking on the emotion of the song by making it real to you. So maybe if there's some emotional quality, the song is sad or bittersweet, you think about a moment in your life where that was true in your life, and that emotion is what you bring forward. So it's not an inauthentic pretending, which is what bad performance is.
Sure.
It's an authentic becoming, which allows us to connect at a very human, healthy, spiritual level. So when it comes to song burnout, the exact same thing is true. There's a point where it's about the song, where the performance is about the performance. The performance is about my expression. That's fine. It's not to say that that's always evil. I think that can be really rewarding and encouraging at times. But if that eventually gives way to the moment being about the shared moment, or the moment being about the guy at the back of the room, and somewhere in the first year, maybe 2010, Manifesto became about the guy at the back of the room for me.
Sure.
That guy is always there. There's never a time where we play Manifesto where that guy isn't there. There's never a time where the guy in the middle of the room isn't like, oh yeah, and they come alive. And I'll play that song until I die with no shame, because it's not I do not care about the song anymore. I do not care. It is 100% about the moment that we have together and all that does in us and through us for when we leave. And I'm shameless about it. I don't care. I don't want to over spiritualize song selection. It can matter at times. It can be a big thing. I think we sometimes make too much of this in terms of like, God is telling me this song needs to happen. Maybe. I mean, most Christians prayed the same liturgy for like 1,000 years. So unless we just thought the church forgot how to be Christian, forgot everything it ever learned, even in the Reformation, in reality, at some point, like, there's something to consistency. There's something to repetition. There's something to knowing that the goal is a beautiful life, and that those beautiful moments fuel a beautiful life lived in Jesus. Sure. And so performance and songs are prayers. I mean, what the Orthodox Church has been praying the Jesus prayer over and over and over every day forever. So, I think on some level I can be okay. There's have you guys heard of James K.A. Smith? He's an author. He wrote a book called Desiring the Kingdom and Imagining the Kingdom. And the pop version of that is called This Is You Are What You Love. Mm-hmm. It's talking about how human beings are not fundamentally thinkers, but are fundamentally lovers. Right? And how all of these little routines that we do shape what we love. They shape what we're pointed towards. They shape how we're going to do it. And he talks a little bit about habit in that like, if the only time brushing your teeth worked was when you were focused on brushing your teeth.
That's good.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
It doesn't. Sometimes you brush your teeth because you just need to have clean teeth.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes in our obsession with momentary authenticity, we sort of act as if, and there is something to be said too for showing up and being present to the activity. That's important. But it's not as simple as saying like, oh no, you should be riddled with guilt if you're singing the song this time and you're worried about the argument you just had. I mean, I think there's something to, on tour this would happen all the time. My kids would be going to bed. Maybe my wife and I, maybe every couple of months we get on the phone because I've been away a lot and we're a little snippy at each other or something right before I'm supposed to take the stage, right? So if momentary authenticity was the thing I was supposed to be concerned about, the entire show would be railroaded and I'd be treating the room as my personal therapists. I am not in the headspace having had a little bickering snit 5 minutes earlier. I'm not in a headspace but that's just selfishness.
Yeah.
And so stepping into the role for a moment to love and serve the room and put things in their right place and sort out this other thing in my life, in its right context in a healthy way. I think that's just healthy emotion. It's just emotional health on some level.
Yeah.
And so I think a little bit of compartmentalization is normal and healthy. In every therapist I've ever been to has said that too. Like there is a little bit of that is normal and good. And so I feel like we have a few of these hang-ups as worship leaders. The average person going to work doesn't have.
Yeah.
And they're not like going to work and going, well, I can't show up for work today because of this thing that happened. I can't. Nope. Sorry. I had this fight with my kid, and so I'm calling in sick for the next 14 days. Like most people don't have that option.
Yeah.
So sometimes I wonder, why do we think we do? No doubt.
That's good. Your Megan will be happy to hear your answer and put me in my place. So no, I've known all this stuff to be true. It's just I struggle with song burnout. I struggle with caring, and I really care about the new songs, and I'm into it and I'm passionate about it. And then I'm done with it. And
well, I think for me, songs aren't the thing.
Right, and that's what I have to learn. And that's what she's got down. Everything you said, she said in one way or another. That's why, sorry, she's my favorite over you.
That's great.
Just kidding. But yeah, I think that's always been my struggle is like, well, the emotional intelligence, right? It's that idea of this isn't about me, and I still haven't figured that out. And I try. I
mean, I don't want to pretend like I'm some expert at this. I'm in the same boat. I think there's a live performance coach named Tom Jackson years ago who sort of pointed out, even in concerts, even if you're not talking about, just talking about the strict technicality of music and doing music well, right? That nobody remembers your song. They remember the moment you made of the song. And
good.
part of the reason, I say this as a guy in it, nobody shoot me. Part of the reason that worship leaders are so obsessed with songs is because that was the only way companies could monetize worship. It is the publishing engine that drives us to be concerned with songs. Because that's the only part of it that can be sold.
Yeah.
And so, like, and I sell things for a living. I'm not trying to be cynical about it. I'm saying it's not that there's no role to that. But we need to see it for what it is in order to do it healthily.
Sure.
You know? And so I think there's really something to like, hey, you know what? The song is a means to an end. And that end is a moment of shared prayer that forms us in the long run. And probably repetition plays a way bigger role than we are wanting to admit in what that is.
No doubt.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you for the hand slap.
No, I did not mean it that way.
No.
Hey, if you need it, you need it, though. Come on now. It's okay.
I'm just messing.
No.
Well, we don't want to keep you all day. Well, I would keep you all day, but I know Mark doesn't want to keep you all day, and you don't want to be kept all day, so.
This is great. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is.
Well, know that we appreciate your time and your wisdom. Thank you so much. We appreciate the time you have given us. It's been a pleasure.
It's a great.
Well, thank you guys. Appreciate you both. This has been tons of fun.